Yeah, I mean, if you only subscribed because of that Fallout video, this is probably a bit different to what you were seeing in the Fallout video. Also, God, this eye patch does not want to stay where I want it to. So, let's get going. Let me ask you a question. Did you ever download Lincoln_Park_num.exe as a child or teenager or really misguided adult who really should have known what .exe was? Or maybe you decided that you really needed to play a game that wasn't available in your region, so you just happened to find a copy hanging out online. Or perhaps you didn't manage to catch a movie when it was in the cinema and DVD releases take fucking ages to be available. Well, the chances are that you are a pirate. I hate to do this, but there is something I have to say for the purposes of keeping my job. I personally do not endorse the practice of online piracy. I respect intellectual property. This video is simply a dispassionate look at online piracy, the causes behind it, the industry reaction, and whether that reaction is proportionate to the crime, and what alternative ways might exist for us to think about the phenomena of online piracy. That might mean, if we take some of this stuff on board, that I don't have to do disclaimers like this in the future if I ever come back to the topic. I'll also be mentioning some previous and current hosts of pirated content during this video because, let's be honest, it's hard to explain and research news items without mentioning the subject of the news item, but I'm not directing anyone to any of these websites, and I will say at the top of this, you should not go to them. Seriously. Don't go to them. Okay? You understand? Good. And yes, I'm aware that the costume I'm wearing for this video, which a special shout out to my partner who helped me put it all together, might make me look partial to one side of this issue. But it's just a costume. You're not a weirdo Remainer FBPE loon who obsesses over clothing and whether that's sending out a secret signal to people. Are you? So that's the plan. A totally dispassionate look at online piracy that hopefully doesn't get me fired. And in case it does get me fired though, at least make sure you like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon because, those things are all very cool things to do. And look, if I'm gonna get fired over it, I may as well get something out of it, right? Alright, let's do the video.
The golden age of online piracy.
Before we get into the real meat of the video, I need to explain what I mean by piracy, because as you might imagine, with something like this where there's a very particular kind of series of interests at play, and it's mainly the corporate interest that I'm thinking about here, but we'll get to that. Definitions can be muddled and vague, but I want to make it as simple as possible, so here's our baseline definition.
Online piracy refers to the unauthorized use or reproduction of copyrighted or patented electronic material, such as music or software files.
I'll also add a couple of thoughts and caveats of my own here. The distribution can either be for money or for free, meaning that if you've ever gone to a dodgy shop in Istanbul in the 2000s to pay what was at the time around 50p for a copy of the latest Football Manager, you're covered by this. But I'd never tell on you if you did that. I'm supposed to wink at this point according to the script, but I'm wearing an eye patch. In fact, you know what? If I'm gonna have a wink in there, I'm gonna do a wink. And I should add that the kind of piracy we're going to be talking about must contain some kind of online element. So no, copying songs from a CD that your friend lent you isn't what we're going to be focusing on here, but it is covered under the same umbrella from the perspective of both the law and the holders of the intellectual property here. So we're pretty clear about what online piracy is at this point, but I will just point out that what online piracy isn't, or what intellectual property infringement isn't, since that's what this is ostensibly all really about. Online piracy is not, for example, taking clips of a movie or video and commenting on them. That falls under what we call fair use, which is a lifesaver if you happen to be a Twitch streamer who enjoys watching horrific dry aging experiments performed by an uncomfortably joyous Brazilian man. Seriously though, go check out my Twitch. It's twitch.tv/SKTheCrusader. Come and revel in the dry aging horror with me. I'm gonna level with you all. The idea of copying someone's work without permission is probably as old as the idea of writing itself, though I have to admit it would be a bit more difficult to do it in cuneiform with the clay tablets. And I would say we don't really know when the first instance of this happening would be, but luckily, for our purposes, we don't care about anything that happens offline. And the internet happens to never forget. So we're quite lucky in that regard, for once. Now, technology having unintentional uses or consequences isn't new, and the dial-up modem was definitely not the first one to have this happen to it. You'll recall, if you watched my video on online anonymity, that there were early bulletin board style forums that essentially required you to download the new posts that people would make on the forum from some dipshit's computer or server, but those were really, really expensive back then, and probably still are really, really expensive. So what if we weren't downloading your friend's post about how crepes are bread? What if we downloaded an image they've made? And admittedly, back then this would take something like 20 hours to download, especially if it were a HD image in the 1980s at that download speed, but no one was doing that. Or what if it was a song? Now, this is speculation, but it's not far-fetched to suggest that, for example, IRC, or if you want the long version of the name, Internet Relay Chat, which had a file sharing component to it, might have been one of the earliest methods for sharing large files, but file sharing doesn't really hit the mainstream until Napster. Napster was one of the earliest peer-to-peer file sharing services, and it specifically focused on sharing music, and the music industry came down like a ton of bricks on it. The charge was particularly led by Metallica. I'm so tired of so much of my content coming back to Metallica's bullshit, you know? Eventually, after a series of legal challenges, some of which were settled, Napster was ordered to shut down, and Metallica, to this day, regard their decision to sue Napster as the right decision, which, to be fair, from their perspective, may not necessarily have been wrong, and we might see why they believe that later. The problem is, and I'll explain in the form of a hypothetical, when you were a teenager, okay, look, if you are currently a teenager watching this, don't at me, just play along, and you downloaded Lincoln_Park_num.exe, did you get arrested for it? No? Well, that's just it. Napster were held liable for what happened on their platform. None of the users were punished. Now, that might be because punishing 80 million registered users is insane and unworkable, but it opened the door to more effective file sharing services, which is where our old friend LimeWire was born, and its introduction of the BitTorrent communication protocol, which allowed file sharing in a decentralized way with no servers, and it really kicked open the door. It spawned a lot of file sharing software, websites dedicated to helping you access the material, all of the carry-on that you might be familiar with today, more or less, opens up because of the door Napster and LimeWire opened. This leads us on to an important question. Why? Why turn to what's legally seen as theft as a means of accessing other people's intellectual property without their permission? Especially when, as we'll see later, the penalty for getting caught can be, to put it mildly, life-altering. I have some thoughts on that. The motivations will vary by what type of media a prospective pirate chooses to collect as their treasure, but broadly speaking, there are a few that all of the media types and software types have in common. So, the motivations that we're going to look at are as follows. 1. The idea you won't get caught. Remember when I asked you whether you as a teenager ever got in trouble for downloading Lincoln_Park_num.exe? It's not getting old, I swear. Well, people aren't stupid. We don't go around taking massive risks for no good reason. And if you know that the chance of getting caught is less than 1 in a million, why wouldn't you take the risk, right? That isn't to say that that level of risk isn't a deterrent for some people, but the fact that enforcement is so infrequent and often targeted at the platforms that facilitate piracy means that individuals just think of it as a no-risk, high-reward situation. The second reason is convenience. Look, sometimes it's just really hard to get something that could be available legally. For example, if you were someone who, for whatever reason, was unable to go to your local video game shop or rental place in the 90s or 2000s, then you might decide that downloading it is preferable to going all the way there, paying, coming all the way back. I mean, what if they don't even have the game there? And, you know, it's a bit of a pain in the ass to go to a place. You know, the internet almost certainly has the thing that you're looking for, and it's much easier to access. So that's probably a pretty strong drive for some people. Or maybe you just think keeping a giant collection of DVDs is, for whatever reason, just not your thing. Easier to keep it on a hard drive, right? And the same kind of arguments go for PC games at the time. There's also a subset of this argument, which is, what if there's no legal means for you to purchase and consume your chosen thing, whatever the thing may be? The common example used is region locking. That is the act of making the media you publish only consumable within specific media markets. For example, a lot of games are only released in Japan, but they have fandoms in America and Europe. And no, I'm not getting into the merits of the fandoms themselves, because holy shit do I not have the patience to deal with that. So let's just sort of power through it, okay? They might decide that in the absence of a legal means to consume the product, that piracy is the only path left to them. At this point, we can see that the pressures that lead to piracy aren't solely caused by factors that a person can control. Like, I didn't decide that NCAA Football 14 would only be sold in America and select international markets. And while I was foolish enough to get it from, I think, a Singaporean website, and in fact, here's the game, I still happen to own it, others may not have been so scrupulous. And I guess it also helps that this game is now selling for like £100 on eBay. So that does soften the blow a little bit of the level of inconvenience to get it. Great game, by the way, if you like American football stuff. The third reason is the cost of a particular piece of media or software. You know the expression, everyone has their price. Well, everyone has a price that they're willing to pay for something. And if you're unwilling to pay the market rate, you know, we're doing air quotes there because you probably know why I'm doing it. Is it really worth that price? Maybe I think the £40 game on Steam is only worth £20. Now, the benefit of Steam is that it has sales on, like, all the time. So the pressure is less pronounced on, say, people using Steam as their primary game purchasing platform. But other people may think it's not worth anything, or that they want to try before they buy, which on the face of it doesn't seem that unreasonable, right? You wouldn't buy a car without test driving it. So maybe there is something reasonable there. In fact, if you look at the prevalence of piracy in particular countries and compare it to relative purchasing power, an interesting correlation comes up.
At a country level, online piracy correlates remarkably strongly with a lack of purchasing power. Higher per capita income coincides with a lower number of pirates per legal users.
The fourth reason that we're going to be looking at is that there are other economic reasons besides the cost of the product. I know we've been talking a lot about music and video games and linkinpark.exe, whatever, right? But other things can be pirated too, including professional software that people need to do their jobs. Now, if you work for a big company, lucky you, they'll probably pay for the licenses for all the software you need. But what if you're a freelancer, right? And you need an image editor that has special features and specific features. And without it, you can't, live. But the act of piracy is legally theft. This is another pressure that's at least partially beyond the control of the potential pirate. I mean, they could just get another job, but also, have you seen the state of the economy? There are, of course, countermeasures in professional software and alternative models of providing software that have emerged as a result of this particular motivation being expressed for piracy, but we'll get to that in a bit. And the final reason I just want to kind of bring up is because you can. Look, sometimes the cheap thrill of piracy is its own reward. There's not really much to add here. I just wanted to throw that out there for you all. I titled this section, at least in the version of the script that I'm using for this, The golden age of online piracy, and all golden ages come to an end. Just play the Civilization games to figure that one out, or, you know, ask a pirate. So there was a moment where online piracy had a lot of cultural salience, so much that it even spawned some political parties, which we'll talk about briefly later on. Then it just seemed to fade, right? With the legal restrictions on certain websites, the trials of the founders of some of these websites, and some of the other responses and developments that have happened since this golden age, it felt like, and it feels like to an extent, that piracy's day seems to have passed. Of course, with something like this, with so many motivations and pressures behind it, that was never really going to last. A combination of poor pay, inflation, the inefficiency of the market, the cost of streaming services, all of those things have led to memes like this being relevant and a kind of perfect illustration of what exactly has gone on as the golden age has faded into the recent past. That meme is a good place for us to begin thinking about what the responses to online piracy have been from both a legal, commercial, and party political perspective. Both? All? From all of those perspectives. That makes more sense. God. One of these responses has been, as that meme showed, the emergence of paid online streaming. Now, paid online streaming ostensibly tackles two of the reasons people would go looking for pirated material. First, it addresses the matter of convenience. If all your favorite shows are available on a website with its own inbuilt media player, then that's easier than having to catch it live on TV, because, let's be real, who the fuck is watching TV in the year of our Lord 2022? And it addresses the inconvenience of large, sprawling physical media collections. So no more having to arrange your DVD collection. You can just log on, search for your favorite show or film, and there it is. The second point it was meant to address was the cost. Let's say you really, for some reason, want to watch 10 or so movies and TV shows a month. I don't really know if that's the normal amount. I mostly just watch Always Sunny on repeat. Is it cheaper to buy 10 DVDs a month or simply pay £10 a month? Now, that's not a trivial amount of money, and I'm not saying that it's easy or anything like that, but that was at least part of the intent of this model. Now, that works, right? If we have one consolidated streaming service. But here's the thing. What if the show you want isn't on one particular service that you already pay for, but it's on another? Okay, maybe you have another £10 a month you can spare. Not a big deal. But what if different seasons of the same show that you enjoy are split across 3 services? You can begin to see how this spirals, because IP holders, especially those who have a lot of capital, will want bespoke streaming services of their own. I mean, just look at Disney Plus. So now it's becoming less convenient and more expensive to legally consume these products. There are analogous services for video games with different games, and sometimes the same game, which I find very confusing, on multiple services. Look, I'm going to level with you all. If it's not on Steam, you're really going to have to convince me to buy it. Plus, I'm pretty content with my Crusader Kings 3 and Fallout New Vegas. Check out the video I did on Fallout New Vegas, by the way, everyone. It was really good and bizarrely popular. There's also been an embrace of free trial models for various bits of professional software. I'm fortunate to know people who make this kind of software, and while this is anecdotal, their suggestion was that the adoption of the free trial model got them more buyers in the long run. This model is an attempt to address people who don't initially match the valuation of the software, or people who want to try before they buy. I would say that back in the day, when games had demos, they used to follow this model. Do games still have demos? I feel like that's kind of been supplanted by the Steam refund policy. But, you know, that may be a thing to think about. There's also been a long history of anti-piracy measures which are designed to remove the convenience of online piracy, particularly in video games. These range from a simple serial number that you used to get in the game manual. God, I feel fucking ancient talking about this stuff. to DRM, which caused a shit ton of controversy when EA added it to the ultimately disappointing Spore, which basically induced a bunch of review bombing of the game on Amazon and was considered an existential threat to PC gaming from some people, with gamers resenting being treated like thieves. That is a direct quote from one of the articles about this, which, given the topic of the video and the way that I've chosen to dress for it, this backfired spectacularly, by the way. I mean, really badly. Just look at this excerpt from an article at the time of the backlash.
But it also has one of the worst ratings on Amazon. 2016 out of the 2,216 ratings are 1 star, because of a concerted campaign by fans protesting its DRM. It has also been downloaded an estimated 500,000 times on BitTorrent, and is well on its way to becoming the most illegally downloaded game ever.
So, yeah, that didn't work, huh? And heavy-handed anti-piracy methods from publishers like this seem to have form for backfiring and actually encouraging piracy, because it ended up being more convenient to have a pirated copy of the game rather than a legal copy of the game. Great work, lads. Brilliant. Fucking spectacular. There are also some more humorous ways to tackle piracy in gaming. Famously, Game Dev Tycoon has an anti-piracy gimmick where when you reach a certain point in the game, you would begin to hemorrhage massive amounts of money from piracy if it detected that you had a pirated version of the game. Not necessarily an accurate depiction of what happens, but I could understand why the devs did this, and at least it wasn't as spectacularly fucking stupid as what EA did. Although that's kind of a high bar to clear. What are the characteristic reactions have been? Of course, extreme legal reactions and attempts to regulate the internet, which pretty much always fail or are pretty much always unenforceable. I want us to think about whether these fines are proportionate and fair for the crime described, because your reaction to it will probably tell you which side of the issue you really come down on. And that's not a judgment on my part, but an invitation for all of us to reflect on why we feel that way, no matter which side we fall on. 2 particular cases spring to mind. The prosecution of the people behind the website The Pirate Bay, which is an example of the hosts of the material being penalised, and this is largely where the effort from the holders of intellectual property is focused these days. The Swedish Supreme Court refused their demand of a hearing, meaning their prison sentences and fines were finalised. The fines were a collective total of 46 million Swedish krona, or at the time $6.7 million, which is what we in the business call a shit ton of money. There was also one of the last cases of an individual downloader being penalised, the case of a woman from Minnesota who had to pay $220,000 for 24 illegally downloaded songs, which, yikes, right? And while this was clearly meant to make an example of the poor woman, I don't think it endeared the Recording Industry Association of America to people, and it certainly doesn't strike me as necessarily proportionate or fair. Sorry, that was dangerously close to expressing an opinion. I mean, I am totally dispassionate. Yes, that's right. It's also worth noting, as I mentioned earlier, that there have been party political expressions of pirate politics in the form of various parties, and some have even gained national representation in Luxembourg, the Czech Republic, and perhaps most famously, and the one that you might know about if you have come upon this video through the usual routes, Iceland. These parties tend to be kind of hard to pin down specifically on the political spectrum, and in fairness, the political spectrum and these weird Cartesian planes people are trying to put politics onto are kind of a load of bullshit anyway, and it almost always leads to weird horseshoe bullshit, like in that video I did that one time. Definitely go check that one out. A lot of shameless plugs today, I don't know, maybe it's the pirate in me, it's coming out. They range from vaguely liberal, libertarian politics with a focus on copyright and patent law, which, yes, really need to be changed, especially if we're not abolishing capitalism, to the kind of, Green parties who lean in that very superficial way that Green parties tend to towards the left of centre. There's almost always an emphasis among these parties on direct democracy, open communication, transparency, and anti-corruption politics. And while a lot of those may seem a bit shallow and nebulous, and in some cases counterproductive to the cause of overthrowing these sort of corrupt institutions that they're actually running up against, on the surface it's not so bad, right? But the lack of impact they've had suggests that this is only really carrying them so far. And if you look at the countries where they've managed to do well, they tend to do better in countries with smaller populations, where it's maybe a bit easier for political parties to break through. And they do have this tendency to be subsumed into and overtaken by other movements that play off these similar themes, particularly anti-corruption politics.
Does online piracy hurt IP holders?
So, to answer the question of whether online piracy hurts IP holders, we need to think about what IP holders believe is happening. So let's get ready to think like the biggest scumbag capitalists imaginable. Music labels. Okay, they're not quite landlords or anything like that, but I guess they're kind of like the landlord of the bands that they have on their label, I guess. Anyway, let's say that you've got a hot new band on your label and they release an album. It goes on Spotify, which pays bands a pittance per stream of the song, and it has physical copies, all the usual stuff, right? You discovered that the album is on a website that allows users to download the album for free using a torrent client. Now, what do you think is going through their heads at this point? I'll give you a minute and I'll give you a clue. It's not, oh boy, fresh exposure for our band, hell yeah! It's not that. It's every single download from this is potentially a sale taken from us and therefore profit we've lost. Now, is this true? No, not quite. Not everyone who engages in piracy can or will pay the rate demanded by the holders of the intellectual property, but they very strongly believe this to be the case. This is where I want to introduce you to the concept of sales displacement. Now, if you're a physicist, first of all, nerd! And second of all, I feel your pain. I really, really do. You're probably imagining displacement as a kind of mass lowered into a bathtub, and that's not it at all. You dipshit. Okay, that was mean. But it's a rather subjective measure where we take all of the instances of piracy and try to estimate what portion of them are really willing to pay for the pirated material, and therefore what percentage of sales have been lost from the IP holder's perspective. Now, I say this is subjective because it's really down to the researcher to determine the threshold of willing people need to be in order to justify a lost sale. And let's just say that research in this area is potentially impacted by where funding is coming from. I think that was the most diplomatic way I could put that. However, are there perhaps other ways for them to prevent some of the issues that they believe are caused by online piracy? Perhaps some ways that don't involve $220,000 fines. Now, I'm aware that what I'm asking for makes no sense, because it would rely on capitalists to, have a thought beyond immediate profit. But let's imagine and dream together for a little bit. And in fact, some of these things have actually been done by capitalists, so maybe we can see why they've been done. Let's think back to the free trial model of professional software. We addressed the anecdotal evidence that leads to more sales, which is good if you're the owner of the software. Now, whether this is applicable to, say, movies is an interesting idea, but I guess that's kind of what trailers are meant to be. That strikes me as a very effective measure. Now, maybe it doesn't necessarily impact the amount of piracy that takes place, but the anecdotal increase in sales strikes me as a sign that the strategy is one worth pursuing where possible if you were the capitalist. There's also further anecdotal evidence from people that I know, and yeah, I get that this is very sources, dude, trust me, but I think this is reasonably logical, so I don't think it's that far-fetched, and if it wasn't reasonably logical, I wouldn't fucking say it. that when pirated software gets patched and there's no crack for the new version of the software, and there are enough desirable features in the new patched version, the tendency is that these pirates will go and purchase the new version. In essence, what's happened is that IP holders are either wrong about what they think is happening, or they're lying. Now, I'm going to break a component of my dispassion here and say that it's pretty obvious that IP holders have an interest in a strictly applied anti-piracy regime. The evidence that piracy causes significant loss of profit to IP holders is, what's the nice way to put this, mixed, and enforcement of these laws through shutdowns of websites, as an example, tends to only cause temporary reductions in overall piracy, as well as only providing benefits to larger, better known holders of intellectual property or more widely distributed intellectual properties. The particular example I want to use is this excerpt on a paper that analysed the impact of the shutting down of the website Mega Upload.
Only movies that premiere in a relatively large number of theatres benefited from the shutdown of Mega Upload. The average effect, however, is negative.
Which does show, as it often does, who the heavy-handed state enforcement tends to benefit. And get this, it's the ones who are already rich. Classic. All done to tackle a problem that, if headlines like this are to be believed, is largely imaginary.
Should we all be pirates now?
To answer this question in this section, I need to remind you all of the disclaimer I made at the beginning. This is a dispassionate analysis and not an endorsement of anything. That being said, it is interesting to consider the forces that make piracy more likely, especially the cost of legal consumption and the lack of legal avenues for consumption. Things like convenience and the other pressures that lead to piracy are still worthy of our consideration. I just want to focus on these for now. The popular game Football Manager is, look, it's a very addictive spreadsheet simulator, but it had a bizarre run-in with Turkey because, and yeah, I do a whole podcast about this kind of thing. Of course, Turkey is a country that managed to have beef with a video game. To make a long story short, in order to get the video game localized in a language, Sports Interactive set a sales threshold for the game. Now here's the kicker. While Turkey definitely has a reputation for piracy being a little tiny bit rife, a legacy of the old Barbary coast, I suppose. But the lack of localization in Turkey is what drove a lot of people to pirate the game in the first place, since without the Turkish language localization, people didn't value it at the rate that it was being sold at in Turkey, and it was relatively expensive. Turkey is a relatively poor country in that way. So there wasn't a legal way to consume a version of the product that people would have valued enough to pay for, or at least pay what Sports Interactive were asking for, which isn't really the fault of the pirates, is it? Especially when Miles Jacobson, the creator of the game, seems to have a very specific beef with Turkey, leading to very funny headlines like this.
Football Manager is getting Turkish language support. Miles Jacobson to Turkey. Buy FM13, don't pirate it.
So, bearing in mind that these forces don't just impact us, but actually disproportionately impact people outside of the Imperial Core or Global North, it may be worth reassessing piracy and considering it as more than simple theft or violation of intellectual property. There's a line of thinking that treats online piracy as a kind of Luddite rebellion against inappropriate or unfair restrictions brought about by the advancement of technology. This somewhat goes against the kind of view that I'm more used to of technology, which is that it isn't good or evil inherently, it's just a matter of how it's used. Instead, in the book Breaking Things at Work by Gavin Mueller, we're invited to rethink the Luddites and technology and our relationship to technology along Marxist lines. And I really recommend the book, but here's the important quote for our purposes because it specifically talks about Napster.
Napster is, in some ways, something of a regression to the old days of the internet. Mass usage of the internet has meant that servers have to be used to house information. Napster, on the other hand, relies on communication between the personal computers of the members of the Napster community. In other words, Napster's peer-to-peer architecture more resembles the distributed computing of the bulletin board system era of the 1980s than the cloud of today that tethers us to the servers of massive tech companies.
Look, really, I just wanted to put that quote in because I thought it was cool, I thought the book was cool, and I think it's worth thinking about. Perhaps there is an argument to be made that online piracy is, whether it's the conscious intention of the pirate or not, a kind of Luddite act of rebellion, relying on older technology to run rings around the legal and political system that's focused on catching up to the more modern forms the internet has taken over time. Which goes some way to explain the inability of enforcement to actually curtail mass online piracy. A glorious and successful Luddite revolt, and no one can really do anything about it. At least not if the information we have provided to us is accurate. It'd make Ned Ludd proud. Again, I'm not taking a side here. This is purely dispassionate. Disclaimer mode, right? God, I'm glad we're near the end of this so I can stop saying that. But information we've seen here today might lead us to conclude that the way intellectual property rights are being enforced online is not ideal. Damn, I really fucking slammed them there, huh? I don't just mean not ideal for the people like that poor woman who got the $220,000 fine or the founders of Pirate Bay. I mean it's not working for the majority of people who own intellectual property. The enforcement of anti-piracy laws has led to attempts to restrict and regulate the internet. They have laid the groundwork for things such as the British Commentariat's insane crusade against online anonymity, all while only helping those at the very top of the various industries seeking protection from online piracy. With the success of free trials, and with the, at best, uncertain impact that online piracy has on sales, and in fact there are suggestions that it can serve as a boost to sales, it may not just be time that the filthy pirates all take in what they're doing and really lean into it, but that more IP owners should actually raise the black flag themselves and declare themselves pirates. Though, I suspect this will remain a beautiful dream, at least for a little while.
Concluding thoughts.
This is a video that's a little difficult to create some real conclusive thoughts for, because it touches so many different things. What ran through my head throughout this when I was writing it and as I was talking about it was just how much of this was about court cases and enforcement of laws. And as you'll know, or maybe you won't if you're new here, we did get an influx of subscribers recently. The general policy here is ACAB, and it's made me think about what does all of this look like under the ideal, beautiful left-wing vision that I know we all share, right? Maybe that's something for a sequel video, because obviously intellectual property as it exists now would probably not exist under socialism. I mean, what form would it take? Perhaps something along the lines of permanent attribution? Let's be honest. The way these laws are enforced and the rate of participation in piracy when we compare the global north and the global south tells me something and should tell us something about the underlying dynamics at play with regards to intellectual property. I realize this is less a conclusion and more a basis for a future video, but maybe that's coming sooner than we think, and hopefully in a slightly more manageable costume, because I'll be honest, I'm dying here. I'm really dying. So, I want to round out this video by thanking my proofreaders, that is Mic Wright and my partner. I also want to really thank my partner for putting together this wonderful costume, although my, there you go, the bit that was dangling there got caught in my shirt and my hair. But, hey, you know, it looks great. It looks great. It's a clip-on earring, I don't have piercings. Yeah. There you go, you all learned something new about me if you made it to this part of the video. Well done, everyone. Hey everyone, post-editing SK here to say, when I was doing my outro, I kind of fucked it, so I forgot to thank the people who provided their fantastic voices for this video. So I just want to thank and shout out my good friends, Ben, who's also my co-host on Peace at Home, you should go check out that podcast, Geraint from Reel Politik, and Alien Bob, who's an excellent Twitch streamer who you should check out. You'll find links to all of their stuff down below. Now, I guess back to me dressed as a pirate thanking the patrons. I also want to thank my patrons. We genuinely cannot get this done without them. Not because they provide like a massive amount of money to it, and this costume was super expensive, right? It wasn't. But they really provide the motivation for me to just keep on doing it, and I really appreciate that. I particularly... Hold on, let's get them up on the treasure wall. I don't know. I don't think it's a treasure wall, but we'll get them up here. And I want to give a special shout out to Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersley Scheider, and Nauseum. I remembered them. I remembered them at last. Thank you very much. You are my true treasure. God, I'm being such a dipshit as we reach the end of this. Genuinely, thank you very much. I have had a blast recording this, and obviously going out shopping for the components of this costume was obviously really fun. Now, everyone, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go and get on with my day and cut up this video for you all. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Do like and subscribe. It really, really helps me out. It's something that you can all do for me, and it will really help me, push on with this. Otherwise, I'm going to get out of your way. Take it easy, everyone.